He kept 2 pregnant sisters for 20 years, the most consanguineous and feared monster of the Appalachians. In the depths of the mountains covered by mist, where silence is only broken by the whistle of the wind between the pine trees, one of the most disturbing cases in American history has been hidden for decades. This is the story of Ezekiel Blackwood, a man who turned his own family into a grotesque genetic experiment, hidden from the eyes of society for almost 2 decades, between 1938 and 1958. The mountains of Appalachians, with their isolated valleys and remote communities, have always been known for housing secrets. In McDowell County, Western Virginia, these secrets became darker than anyone could imagine. It was in this region, known for its coal mines and extreme poverty during the Great Depression, that the Blackwood family established its property, away from everything and everyone. The property of the Blackwood was at the end of an almost impassable dirt road, surrounded by dense forests on all sides. The main house, an old 2-story wood construction, remained partially hidden by centenary trees. Around small makeshift huts served as extensions of the main residence, forming a family complex isolated from the rest of the world. Ezekiel Blackwood was born in 1905, the son of miners who died when he was only 12 years old. Created by a distant uncle who mistreated him, he developed a reclined and authoritarian personality. In 1930, he inherited his family property and brought his 2 younger sisters with him, Martha and Ruth, then 18 and 16 years old. The 3 brothers lived isolated, having little contact with the local community. What no one knew is that behind those worn wood walls, Ezekiel was beginning to implement a distorted view of family preservation that would result in a genetic nightmare of unimaginable proportions. He had a peculiar theory, explains Dr. Thomas Morgan, a historian specializing in isolated communities from the Appalachians. Based on a distorted understanding of genetics and influenced by eugenic ideas circulating at that time, Ezekiel believed that the mixture of family blood would strengthen certain characteristics he considered superior. He developed an obsession with the idea of creating a pure lineage of Blackwood. Martha Blackwood's first pregnancy occurred in 1938. At the time, the closest neighbors, who lived more than 5 kilometers away, believed she had married a man from another city. No one has ever seen this supposed husband, but the explanation was accepted without question, as was common at that time and region where privacy was respected, almost as a religion. People at that time and in that place lived for an unprecedented code, says 93-year-old Eliza Jenkins, one of the few living people who came to contact the Blackwood. You took care of your life and let others take care of them. That's how we survived in the mountains. What Eliza and others didn't know was that there was no husband. Martha was expecting a son of her own brother, Ezekiel, the beginning of a macabre plan that would last more than 2 decades. Less than a year later, Ruth also got pregnant. Once again, the story of a marriage to an outside man has been spread to explain the situation. But within that isolated property, the 2 sisters had become prisoners of their own brother, forced to generate children in a distorted attempt to raise what Ezekiel called the perfect lineage of the Blackwood. The records found decades later reveal that between 1938 and 1958, Martha gave birth to 9 children, while Ruth had 7. 16 children born of consanguineous unions, condemned before they even arrived in the world. What we need to understand is that at that time, knowledge about the effects of consanguinity already existed, but was not widespread, especially in isolated rural communities, explains Dr. Caroline Fisher, a geneticist at West Virginia. Weddings between cousins were relatively common in some rural areas until the mid-20th century, but sibling unions were universally taboo. Ezekiel was not only ignoring social norms, but deliberately challenging them based on their own distorted theories. The genetic consequences were devastating. Of the 16 children born, records indicate that only 11 survived beyond early childhood. Among the survivors, serious health problems were the rule, not the exception. When we talk about close consanguinity, as among brothers, we are facing a scenario where harmful recessive genes have a much greater probability of manifesting itself, Dr. Fisher continues. This can result in a variety of conditions, from heart problems, congenital, even severe intellectual deficiencies, and physical deformities. Martha's first child, Joseph, born in 1938, apparently seemed healthy in the early years, giving Ezekiel the false confirmation of his theories. However, as more children were born, the problems began to manifest themselves more and more evidently. The 5th son of Martha, born in 1945, had a severe cardiac malformation and died before turning 2. Ruth's 3rd daughter was born with polydactylia, with 6 fingers in each hand. To keep her terrible secret, Ezekiel rarely allowed children to leave the property. The few that were occasionally seen in the nearest city were always accompanied by Ezekiel himself, who explained his unusual appearances as a result of a family disease. This extreme isolation was crucial for horror to continue for so long. Ezekiel controlled all aspects of life on property. He was the only one who went to the city to buy supplies and interact with the outside world. Martha and Ruth, effectively prisoner, took care of the children and kept the property working under the vigilant eyes of their brother. The control he exercised was absolute, says Dr. Morgan. Based on the diaries found later, we know that Ezekiel had a meticulous record of each pregnancy, every birth, even the physical characteristics that each child developed. It was as if conducting a horrible experiment, using his own family as guinea pigs. The isolation, widespread poverty of the region, and the natural distrust of the outsiders created the perfect environment so that this situation would continue without being discovered for almost 2 decades. The few people who occasionally suspected that something was wrong hesitated to get involved, following the unpaid code of the mountains not to interfere with the affairs of others. Check it out if it is already subscribed to this channel. If you want to unravel the darkest secrets in human history that will never be taught in schools, this is your opportunity to dive into the abyss of the human condition with our exclusive investigations. The environment where the children of the Blackwood family grew was a separate world, isolated and governed by Ezekiel's distorted laws. The property, with approximately 15 hectares of rugged land, had become a microcosm where society rules did not apply. Over the years, as the number of children increased, Ezekiel expanded property facilities. Small cabins were built around the main house, creating a kind of isolated community. Older children helped take care of the younger ones, forming a complex and dysfunctional hierarchy. Joseph, the firstborn, born in 1938, assumed an authority lower than Ezekiel's. Apparently without serious physical deformities, he has developed significant behavioral problems. Subsequent reports of neighbors describe a young man of erratic behavior, alternating between periods of extreme docility and violent explosions of anger. What we see in Joseph's case is a classic example of neurological effects that can result from consanguinity, explains Dr. Robert Patterson, neuropsychiatrist at Pittsburgh University. Studies show that children of nearby consanguineous relationships are more likely to develop neurochemical imbalances that affect behavior even when they have no obvious physical deformities. Rebecca, Ruth's first daughter, born in 1939, had a condition known as heterochromia, eyes of different colors, one blue and another brown. Although this condition itself is not necessarily the result of consanguinity, in case it was accompanied by severe hearing impairment. Despite these limitations, records suggest that Rebecca has developed a remarkable intelligence, creating a system of communication with other children. Daily life on Blackwood property followed a rigorous routine established by Ezekiel. Children were awakened before dawn to perform tasks on the small farm that guaranteed family livelihood. They cultivated potatoes, corn, beans, and kept some chickens and pigs. Formal education was virtually non-existent, limited to the little that Martha and Ruth could teach. It is important to understand the context of the time, says historian Dr. Morgan. In the rural areas of Appalachians during that time, it was not uncommon for children to receive little or no formal education. Child labor in family farming was the norm, not the exception. This helped camouflage the situation of Blackwood, as the educational isolation of children did not arouse suspicion. Children's health was precarious. Without access to appropriate medical care, many treatable conditions, chronic and debilitating, were adorned. Martha's third daughter, Eleanor, born in 1942, developed a severe scoliosis that, without treatment, resulted in a deformity of the spine that limited her movements. Even so, records indicate that she worked in the medicinal herbal garden that Martha kept, learning how to use local plants to treat ordinary diseases. The use of traditional herbal medicine was common in the rural communities of Appalachians, explains Dr. Margaret Wilson, an expert in ethnobotany. Many of these communities were days away from the nearest doctor, so they developed a deep knowledge about the medicinal properties of local plants. In the case of Blackwood, this knowledge was probably crucial to the survival of many of the children. The twins Thomas and Timothy, born of Ruth in 1944, had a particularly tragic case. Both were born with a leporine lip and palatine cleft, conditions that made food and speech difficult. Timothy, who also had a deformity in his left leg, died at the age of 4 after contracting pneumonia during a particularly rigorous winter. Thomas survived, but developed a severe speech problem that isolated him even more within an isolated environment. As children grew, Ezekiel implemented the most disturbing aspect of their plan, the continuation of the consanguinity cycle. When Joseph turned 16 in 1954, Ezekiel began preparing him to assume what he called family responsibilities. In his diaries, found decades later, Ezekiel described in clinical and disturbing details as he planned to use Joseph to strengthen the lineage with his own sister half when they reached the proper age. What we see here is the perpetuation of a cycle of intergenerational abuse, says Dr. Helen Richards, a psychologist specializing in family trauma. Ezekiel was not just imposing his control over his sisters, but planning to extend this control to the next generation, creating a trauma legacy that could continue indefinitely if it was not interrupted. The family's isolation was maintained through a combination of fear and misinformation. Children were taught early on that the outside world was hostile and dangerous. Ezekiel reinforced this belief by reporting exaggerated or completely manufactured stories about people who had been persecuted or killed because they are different, creating an obvious parallel with the situation of their own children. This kind of manipulation is a classic tactic in coercive control situations, explains Dr. Richards. In convincing victims that the outside world is more dangerous than the abusive environment, the perpetrator eliminates the possibility of escape or search for help. In the case of Blackwood, this isolation was particularly effective due to remote location and limited social interaction. As the 1950s advanced, the situation on the Blackwood property became increasingly unsustainable. The growing number of children, many with significant medical needs, pressured limited family resources. Martha, after 9 pregnancies in precarious conditions, had severe health problems. Ruth, younger, the cycle of forced pregnancies continued, giving birth to her 7th son in 1956. Life conditions deteriorated visibly. The main house, never properly maintained, was beginning to have serious structural problems. During the winter of 1956-1957, particularly severe in the region, reports indicate that the family was forced to focus on only a few rooms of the main house to keep heat, creating overcrowding and unhealthiness conditions. It was in this context of growing deterioration that events began to head for the inevitable moment when the outside world would finally discover the horrors of the Blackwood property. The catalyst of this discovery would be a desperate decision made by Rebecca, then 18, who would forever change the fate of the family. What happened on the Blackwood property represents one of the most extreme cases of documentary isolation and consanguinity in the modern history of the United States, concludes Dr. Morgan. It is a disturbing case study on how geographical isolation, poverty, and authoritarian control can create conditions for systematic abuse that remain hidden for decades. The year 1957 marked the beginning of the end to the reign of terror of Ezekiel Blackwood. The winter of that year was particularly brutal in the mountains of Appalachians, with temperatures that reached 30 negative degrees and snowfalls that further isolated the already remote property of the Blackwood. It was during this winter that Rebecca, then 18, began planning her escape. Despite her hearing impairment, she had developed a keen understanding of the world around her, and knew in this that the situation in which they lived was not normal. The diaries she kept secretly, found years later, reveal a young woman who, even created in extreme isolation, developed her own moral conscience and an unshakable determination. Rebecca represented an anomaly within the closed system created by Ezekiel, explains Dr. Richards. Despite all attempts at isolation and indoctrination, she has developed a critical perspective on her situation. This is not uncommon for survivors of abusive environments. Even in extreme situations, human resilience can manifest in surprising forms. Rebecca's plan was bold, considering its limited understanding of the outside world. For years, she had collected and hidden small useful objects, a pocket knife, matches, pieces of rope, and even a rudimentary map of the county she found in an old book in the house. She also secretly kept food from meals, drying her to preserve. The opportunity came in February 1957, during one of Ezekiel's rare trips to the city to buy supplies. Normally, he took Joseph with him on these occasions, but this time he decided to leave him behind, to help fix the roof of one of the cabins that had collapsed under the weight of the snow. With absent Ezekiel and Joseph busy, Rebecca took advantage of the chance. Taking only a small bundle with her few belongings and provisions, she escaped through the forest in the middle of a snowfall with bad weather to cover her tracks. What followed was an epic and desperate journey. For 3 days, Rebecca wandered through the snow-covered mountains, guiding the sun during the day and the stars at night, as she had learned by observing Ezekiel. Without proper equipment and facing freezing temperatures, it suffered hypothermia and severe cold at the ends. When we think of what Rebecca faced, it is almost unbelievable that she has survived, says Dr. William Harper, a remote medical expert. A young woman with hearing impairment, with no experience in the outside world, crossing one of the most inhospitable regions of Appalachians during a blizzard, the chances were minimal. Your survival speaks volumes about your willpower. On the morning of the 4th day, Rebecca was found by a local hunter, Edgar Thompson, who initially confused her with an injured animal. Semi-conscious and suffering from advanced hypothermia, she was rushed to Welch's small clinic, the nearest city. What followed was the slow unfolding of a horror that the local community could barely understand. Unable to speak due to exhaustion and hearing limitations, Rebecca initially communicated through rudimentary drawings. It was nurse Sarah Collins who finally established an effective communication system with the young woman. "I will never forget the moment I understood what she was trying to tell us," said Collins years later in an interview with the local newspaper. "I first thought I was playing badly, that it was impossible. But the more she explained, the clearer we were facing something truly horrible." Local sheriff, initially skeptical Frank Miller, organized a short expedition to the Blackwood property to investigate Rebecca's allegations. What they found confirmed their worst fears: 15 people living in deplorable conditions, many with visible deformities and significant signs. "It was like entering another world," said Deputy James Wilson, who accompanied the sheriff on that first visit. The main house was in a state of advanced decomposition. The smell of mold and illness was oppressive. Younger children looked at us as if they had never seen strangers before. Some hid, others were paralyzed in fear. Ezekiel, surprised by the authorities' arrival, initially tried to explain the situation as a case of unusual family who preferred to live in isolation. When faced with Rebecca's specific allegations, he became aggressive and tried to resist prison. It was necessary to intervene several deputies to contain it. Martha and Ruth, after decades of abuse and isolation, showed clear signs of deep psychological trauma. Initially, Ezekiel defended a typical behavior of prolonged abuse victims. It was only after weeks of medical care and counseling that they started talking about the horrors they had faced. "The Blackwood case challenged all the existing protocols at the time," explains Dr. Linda Peterson, a historian specializing in rural social services. In 1957, the social service system in rural areas was virtually non-existent. There was no precedence to deal with a case of this magnitude and complexity. The local community, medical services, and authorities had to improvise, creating answers as they advanced. The story from the Blackwood family exploded in the local media and eventually attracted national attention. The newspapers of the time portrayed the case with a mixture of genuine horror and morbid sensationalism. Headlines like "Horror Family in the Mountains" and "The Appalachian Monster" dominated the first pages. If you are feeling impacted by this story, leave it in the comments. May justice be made for the victims of the Blackwood. Your voice is important to show that we do not tolerate such atrocities, even decades later. For Blackwood children, the rescue represented a new type of trauma. Suddenly exposed to a world they misunderstood, many showed severe difficulties in adaptation. The authorities struggled to determine what to do with them, as there were no adequate facilities for their specific needs. "The system was simply not prepared for such a case," continues Dr. Peterson. "There were no institutions specialized for children with multiple deficiencies resulting from consanguinity. The options were limited to general orphanages or psychiatric institutions, none of which are suitable for their needs." The discovery of the Blackwood family also raised unprecedented legal issues. Ezekiel was arrested and accused of multiple crimes, including kidnapping, private jail, and other offenses. However, the laws of the time did not specifically contemplate the type of systematic and multi-generational abuse he had perpetrated. "The Blackwood case revealed significant gaps in the legal system," explains Dr. Harold Jenkins, professor of historical criminal law. "Prosecutors had to be creative in the application of existing laws. This case would eventually contribute to the evolution of legislation related to family abuse and child neglect in the following decades." Ezekiel Blackwood's trial, held in 1958, was one of the most sensational in the history of Western Virginia. Although his lawyers tried to claim insanity, Ezekiel was considered mentally capable of facing the trial. The testimonies of Martha and Ruth, although painful, were crucial to his conviction. The records of the trial reveal a man who, until the end, believed he was justified in his actions, says Dr. Jenkins. Ezekiel often interrupts the procedures to explain his theories about genetic purity and the superiority of his family lineage. His apparent lack of remorse shocked even the most experienced court observers. Ezekiel Blackwood was sentenced to multiple consecutive penalties, ensuring that he would remain in prison for the rest of his life. He died at West Virginia State Penitentiary in 1972, apparently without ever showing regret for his actions. For Martha and Ruth, the rescue brought a freedom that initially seemed as frightening as captivity. After receiving extensive medical treatment, the two sisters were gradually reinstated to society. Martha, whose health had been severely compromised by 9 pregnancies in precarious conditions, never completely recovered. She has lived her last years at a nursing home in Charleston, where she died in 1975 of heart complications. Ruth, being younger and having suffered less physical damage, got a more substantial recovery. With the help of social programs and the support of local religious groups, she eventually learned to read and write, and spent her last years working as a volunteer in a shelter for women victims of domestic violence. He died in 1988, having dedicated 3 decades of his free life to help other women escape abusive situations. Ruth's story represents a remarkable testimony of human resilience, says Dr. Richards. After decades of unimaginable abuse, she not only survived, but found the purpose of helping other victims. Her journey reminds us that even after the most severe trauma, recovery and transformation are possible. The consequences of Ezekiel Blackwood's distorted genetic experiment extended far beyond the initial rescue of children in 1957. For the 11 surviving children, the impact of extreme consanguinity would shape the rest of their lives, creating medical, psychological, and social challenges that the science of time barely began to understand. The Blackwood case represents one of the first documented studies of extreme multi-generational consanguinity in the United States, explains Dr. Edward Roberts, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins University. From a scientific point of view, it provided valuable insights on the effects of severe endogamy on humans, although at an unacceptable human cost. Blackwood children's initial medical evaluations revealed an alarming spectrum of conditions. In addition to visible physical deformities, such as Eleanor's scoliosis, Thomas's lip and polydactylia, observed in several siblings, exam. The most detailed revealed even more serious internal problems. 6 of the 11 children had congenital cardiac defects of varying degrees of severity. 8 showed impairment of renal function. Almost all showed some degree of cognitive impairment, although the extension was significantly from child to child. What we observed in the Blackwood case is the effect of the so-called endogamic depression, continues Dr. Roberts. When genetically close individuals have children, the likelihood of harmful recessive genes drastically manifest themselves. In cases of extreme consanguinity, such as brothers by multiple generations, these effects are exponentially amplified. The 1950s health system was not prepared to deal with such complex cases. Blackwood children were distributed among several hospitals and institutions, specializing in Virginia, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania, often separated from each other, which added emotional trauma to their already significant physical challenges. Joseph, the firstborn that Ezekiel was preparing to continue his distorted legacy, had the most complex psychological case. Assessments revealed a severely fragmented personality, alternating between periods of lucidity and psychotic episodes. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, he spent most of his adulthood in psychiatric institutions, dying in 1983 at the age of 45. Rebecca, whose brave escape had exposed the case, faced her own challenges. In addition to hearing impairment, later exams revealed a cardiac condition that required multiple surgeries. Despite these difficulties, she demonstrated a remarkable adaptability. With the support of dedicated social workers, he learned sign language and eventually graduated in high school through a special program. Rebecca has become a symbol of hope, comments Marion Foster, one of the social workers who worked with her children Blackwood. Despite everything she faced, she kept an insatiable curiosity about the world and an unshakable determination to create a better life for herself. Thomas, who survived while his twin brother Timothy passed away in childhood, perhaps faced the most difficult way. With multiple facial deformities and severe speech problems, he faced significant social rejection even in institutions created to help him. Medical records indicate that he underwent 17 reconstructive surgeries between 1958 and 1970, with limited results. The case of Thomas illustrates how the effects of consanguinity go far beyond the physical, says Dr. Richards. The psychological impact of growing not only with visible deformities, but also with the knowledge of its origin, created additional trauma layers that medical treatments could not address. For the younger children born in the 1950s, the destination was equally challenging. Mary, Martha's last daughter, born in 1956, had a rare genetic condition that affected bone development. At 2, when she was rescued, she could barely sit without support. Subsequent medical evaluations revealed that she also suffered from severe visual problems, seeing only figures and basic forms. Children born in the final stages of this cycle of consanguinity had even more severe conditions, explains Dr. Roberts. This is consistent with what we know about prolonged consanguinity. The effects tend to intensify throughout generations as the genetic pool becomes increasingly limited. The medical history of children Blackwood has become an important case study for emerging genetics of the time. Doctors and researchers, recognizing the scientific value of these cases despite their tragic origins, meticulously documented each condition, creating one of the first comprehensive records of the effects of extreme consanguinity on humans. It is important to understand that in the 1950s, human genetics was still in its childhood, says Dr. Fisher. DNA itself had been identified as genetic material just a few years earlier in 1944, and its structure was discovered by Watson and Crick in 1953. The Blackwood case occurred at a pivotal moment for genetic science. The information collected from children, Blackwood contributed significantly to the scientific understanding of the mechanisms of heredity and the risks of consanguinity. Studies based on their cases have been published in medical magazines throughout the 1960s and 1970s, always with pseudonyms to protect their identities. In addition to medical challenges, the children Blackwood faced significant obstacles to social integration. Growing up in extreme isolation, many showed severe difficulties in socialization and adaptation to basic behavior standards. Some have never developed common skills, appropriate levels, remaining functionally nonverbal despite years of therapy. What we see in the most severe cases among children, Blackwood, is the combined impact of committed genetics and extreme social deprivation, explains Dr. Patterson. It is impossible to separate completely, as its cognitive and behavioral challenges resulted from genetic factors, and how much was the consequence of the isolated and abusive environment in which they were created. The 1950 and 1960s social assistance system struggled to properly deal with such complex cases. Many of the Blackwood children underwent multiple placements, transferred between orphanages, hospitals, and specialized institutions as their needs evolved or when existing facilities were inadequate. We must remember that this was a time when institutionalization was the standard response for children with significant disabilities, says Dr. Peterson. Community integration and family-centered service model, which we would consider standard today, simply did not exist as viable options. Some of the Blackwood children, particularly those with less severe disabilities, eventually achieved some degree of independence. Eleanor, despite his severe scoliosis, developed exceptional handicraft skills and eventually gained life by creating detailed tapestries, some of which were exhibited in regional folk art galleries. Rebecca, whose escape had exposed the case, perhaps built the most conventional life among all the brothers. After completing his education, he worked as an assistant in a Pittsburgh library for over 3 decades. Although he has never married or had children, a decision that, according to his diaries, was influenced by the fear of transmitting troubled genes, she developed a circle close to friends and was known for her involvement in causes of people with disabilities. Rebecca's journey from extreme isolation to law is remarkable, says Dr. Richards. She has transformed her trauma into a commitment to help others, particularly people with hearing impairment. Her diaries reveal someone who spent her life seeking to understand her own story and used this understanding to create positive changes. For others, however, Ezekiel Blackwood's legacy proved impossible to overcome. 4 of the 11 surviving children have never left institutional environments, requiring care 24 hours a day due to the severity of their physical and cognitive conditions. The institutions where they lived reported that, even decades after their rescue, some still exhibited severe trauma behaviors, such as rocking the body repeatedly or reacting with terror to certain stimuli that triggered traumatic memories. Over the years, researchers and doctors have continued to monitor their children Blackwood, always with their consent or that of their legal guardians. This long-term follow-up has provided valuable insights on how the effects of consanguinity and prolonged trauma evolve throughout their lives. What we learned from the accompaniment of children Blackwood was that some conditions tend to get worse with age, explains Dr. Roberts. For example, heart problems that were managed in youth often became more severe in mid-aged. Several of them developed kidney failure at relatively young ages, requiring dialysis or transplants. The life expectancy of children Blackwood has proven significantly reduced. Of the 11 rescued in 1957, only 3 lived beyond the age of 50. Most died of complications related to congenital conditions that were exacerbated by aging. Each body system was somehow affected by consanguinity, continues Dr. Roberts. The compromised immune system made them more vulnerable to infections. Metabolic problems made it difficult to regulate blood glucose. Bone deformities often led to early and severe arthritis. It was as if aging at an accelerated rate. Rebecca, the most resilient of the group, was also the one that lived the longest. She died in 2010 at the age of 71, complications related to congestive heart failure, a condition she had managed for decades. His diaries, which cover more than 60 years, were donated to the University of West Virginia, where they constitute a valuable archive for researchers in genetics, psychology, and history. Rebecca's diaries are extraordinary, says Dr. Peterson, who helped catalogue the collection. They document not only their own journey, but they also offer a unique perspective on the evolution of social and medical understanding of disability throughout the second half of the 20th century. She watched and commented on how attitudes towards people like her and her brothers changed with time. Blackwood's genetic legacy extended beyond the first generation. Although most children have never had their own children, it is due to infertility resulting from genetic conditions or personal choice. 3 of them eventually formed families. Eleanor had a daughter, Sarah, with a man he met through a community arts program. Sarah was born in 1968 and, although no significant physical deformities, was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in adolescence, a condition that some researchers suggest being related to committed genetic inheritance. When we talk about consanguinity, the effects may persist by generations, even after the introduction of new genes in the family pool, explains Dr. Fisher. This is because many recessive harmful genes can remain in a heterozygous state without manifesting phenotypically, but still present to be potentially passed on. Michael, the 6th son of Martha, had 2 children. Both were born with mild intellectual disability, though significantly less severe than that of the father. One of them also developed type 1 diabetes in childhood, another condition that can have genetic components. Blackwood grandchildren represent an interesting case of how the effects of consanguinity can be diluted but not completely eliminated in a generation, says Dr. Roberts. They tend to have less severe conditions, but they still carry a genetic load that makes them more vulnerable to certain diseases and conditions. The Blackwood case continues to be studied by modern geneticists who now have access to tools and understanding that were unimaginable in the 1950s. Samples of preserved DNA, collected with consent during medical examinations over the years, have recently been analyzed using advanced genomic technologies, revealing with unprecedented accuracy the specific mechanisms by which consanguinity affected the family. What we are discovering now with modern genomic analysis is that the impact of consanguinity on the human genome is even more complex than we imagined, explains Dr. Fisher. These are not just about individual genes, but how whole gene systems interact. The Blackwood case is helping us map these ways that can eventually benefit our understanding of rare genetic diseases in general. In the mountains of Appalachians, memories are long, and the stories persist through generations as fog between the valleys. More than 6 decades after the discovery of the Blackwood family, the echoes of that tragedy continue to reverberate, both in the region where it occurred and in the broader field of scientific and social understanding of consanguinity. The property of the Blackwood, that scenario of horror for almost 2 decades, remained abandoned for many years after the children's rescue. The local community, deeply impacted by the revelation of the horrors that had occurred so closely, seemed reluctant to approach the place. The main house eventually collapsed under the weight of years of negligence, and the forest gradually claimed the small huts who once sheltered the Blackwood children. There was a feeling among the places that this place was somehow stained, explains Harold Jenkins, a local historian born in 1945 who spent his life documenting the story of McDowell County. It was not superstition in the conventional sense, these were practical people, but there was a tacit consensus that that land should be left at peace as a form of respect for the victims. In 1972, the same year Ezekiel Blackwood died in prison, the county finally took over the property due to unpaid taxes. After considerable debates about what to do with the earth, it was decided to turn it into a small nature reserve. Today, the Hope Springs Memorial Park occupies the site, with hiking trails and picnic areas. Her small discreet plaque at the entrance recognizes the dark history of the place, dedicating the park to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of extreme adversity. For the local community, the Blackwood case represented a significant inflection point. The intense scrutiny of the national media that followed the discovery of the family forced a review of practices and attitudes that had allowed such a situation to persist for so long without intervention. The unnoticed code of not interfering with the affairs of others, which was so strong in the rural communities of the Appalachians, began to be questioned, says Dr. Peterson. People began to recognize that there was a difference between respecting privacy and ignoring signs of abuse. It was a significant cultural change that eventually led to the strongest community networks to protect children and vulnerable families. In the following decades, several local initiatives have emerged in response stand directly to the case. In 1965, a mobile health clinic began operating in the region, bringing basic medical care to remote communities. In 1978, the Rebecca Blackwood Center for Children with Special Needs in Charleston, West Virginia was established, offering specialized services for children with multiple disabilities. The name of the center was deliberately chosen, explains Margaret Wilson, one of the founders. We wanted to honor Rebecca's courage and transform a horror story into something positive. The center has become a symbol of how communities can learn from past tragedies and create better care and protection systems. In the field of genetics, the Blackwood case continued to influence research and clinical practices. Blackwood children's collected data and their descendants were incorporated into broader studies on consanguinity and their effects, contributing to the development of better genetic counseling tools and prenatal diagnosis. Advances in genetics in the decades following the Blackwood case have transformed our ability to understand and mitigate the risks associated with consanguinity, explains Dr. Roberts. Today we can identify harmful recessive genes and offer options such as in vitro fertilization with pre-implementation for families at risk. These technologies were unimaginable in Ezekiel's time, but partly built on the knowledge obtained from cases such as his. The history of the Blackwood also found its way to educational curricula, particularly in medical ethics, social work, and genetic courses. Stripped of the sensational elements that dominated media coverage at the time, the narrative now serves as a powerful case study on the intersections between social isolation, abuse of power, and genetic vulnerability. When I teach about the Blackwood case for my social work students, I emphasize how multiple systems failed with these children, says Dr. James Wilson, professor at West Virginia University. It was not only the absence of adequate social services in rural areas, but also cultural norms that discouraged intervention, gaps in children's protection legislation, and a limited understanding of family abuse signs. It is a powerful lesson on the need for comprehensive approaches to child protection. For the few direct Blackwood descendants still alive, family history remains a complex legacy with which they continue to deal with. Sarah, Eleanor's daughter, and now 57, has become a vocal defender of greater education, about the risks of consanguinity and the importance of genetic counseling. "My mother never hid from me from where I came from," Sarah shared in a rare interview in 2005. "She believed I had the right to know my story, no matter how painful. This knowledge allowed me to make informed choices about my own life, including the decision to have no biological children due to continued genetic risks." Michael Blackwood's children, the only other known direct descendants, chose to maintain a lower profile. Both legally changed their surnames in adulthood and rarely discuss their connection to the case. This distance decision reflects the complex identity and stigma issues that continue to affect families with consanguinity stories, even generations later. "The stigma associated with consanguinity remains powerful in our society," says Dr. Richards. For Blackwood descendants, there is the additional challenge of being connected to a case that has become almost legendary in his notoriety. The decision to embrace this story, as Sarah made, or distance himself from her, as Michael's sons have chosen, represents different but equally valid coping strategies. Rebecca Blackwood, in her final diaries written shortly before her death in 2010, reflected on the long range of Ezekiel's acts. "Sometimes I think what my brother did was how to throw a stone into a lake. The stones sink a long time ago, but the waves continue to spread, affecting people he never knew and never know. I hope that in time, these waves carry not only pain, but also wisdom, that our story serves as a warning and perhaps as a catalyst for change." Your wish seems to have been fulfilled in many ways. The Blackwood case has contributed to significant reforms in children's protection legislation, advances in the genetic understanding of consanguinity, and greater social awareness of the dangers of extreme isolation. A history of unimaginable horror has become over the decades a source of knowledge that has potentially prevented similar tragedies. When we look at the Blackwood case legacy today, we see so much the consequences, tragic isolation and abuse, as the potential for healing and positive change, concludes Dr. Peterson. It's a reminder that even the darker stories can eventually shed light on ways for a better future. In 2018, 60 years after the family's initial discovery, a small memorial was erected in the cemetery where several of the Blackwood children were buried over the years. The simple bronze plaque does not mention the consanguinity or specific horrors they have faced, but brings a powerful message. In memory of Blackwood children, may their lives teach us compassion, vigilance, and the responsibility we have with each other. In those same mountains as the Appalachians, where Ezekiel once ruled his small kingdom of terror, communities now work actively to break the isolation cycle that has so long defined the region. Social extension programs, better roads and infrastructure, and a growing awareness of the importance of community connections have helped turn areas that were once turned off from the outside world. However, experts warn that conditions that allowed the Blackwood case, extreme isolation, persistent poverty, and lack of access to education and social services, still exist in pockets across the country. The Blackwood case should not be seen as a historical aberration that could not happen today, warns Dr. Wilson. Although we have better protection systems and greater awareness, there are still families living in extreme isolation. Continuous surveillance and investment in rural social services remain essential. For those who study the case professionally, and for the few who carry their legacy in the blood, the history of Blackwood serves as a dark reminder of what can happen when isolation combines with moral distortion and scientific ignorance. But it also offers glimpses of hope in the courage of Rebecca, the resilience of the surviving children, and the positive changes that emerged from the ashes of their tragedy. In the end, the story of Blackwood is not just about consanguinity or isolation, reflects Sarah, Ezekiel's granddaughter. It is about how we choose to respond to darkness, if we perpetuate or work to turn it into luce. My mother chose the light, just like her sister Rebecca. It's this legacy, not the genes I carry, that define who I am. If you watched so far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying I watched here, so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Be sure to subscribe to follow more impactful stories like this, leave your like to support our work, and share with friends and family who are also interested in these deep historical investigations into the darkest secrets of humanity.